So Nick,
Adam.
have you seen this whole iron thing in Assyria? It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I've seen the whole iron thing. How did that all get started?
Well, in about 1300 BC, the Hittites and the Assyrians, they simultaneously invented iron, and it's a pretty cool thing because sometimes the best inventions are invented in many places at once by many people at once.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think around actually the Egyptian king Khufu, they found in his tomb pyramid 5,200 years ago, 3,200 BCE. They actually found a dagger that came from the Hittites' king there.
That's pretty cool. It's interesting how this kind of stuff gets around, but it's not really surprising when you consider the fact that Assyria, using these kinds of iron weapons, more or less conquered what I guess you could call the known world at the time.
Yeah, they conquered most of the Fertile Crescent there, so that's pretty much all of the world.
You gotta wonder though, Nick, like if they hadn't had this invention of iron and instead they'd stuck to bronze longer, like a lot of the nations' armies that they fought, would they have gotten so far? Do you think their innovations would have allowed them to get as far as they did?
I'd say they for sure modernized all the warfare in Asia Minor. And yeah, I would go, of course, I'm in no position to say whether or not they did, but if they didn't have iron and didn't imply it into their warfare, they definitely wouldn't have conquered as much as they did there.
Iron's actually really cool though because I mean bronze really sucks. It's really heavy, it's not durable, it's not
Well,
nearly as strong as iron.
well, compared to iron, it sucks. I think it's a game changer. They're just much harder. It was, of course, much harder to make. You couldn't smelt it, or you had to hammer it instead of just liquidizing it and mixing it. So
You couldn't cast it, yeah,
yeah,
because it
you
would
couldn't
become
cast it.
like brittle, right?
Right.
If you were to, let's say, hit it against bronze, it would shatter because it wasn't strong enough. But I guess you'd say they tempered it and they did it more slowly, and it
Right.
resulted in like that much stronger blade.
Right. So what do you think it was that they did with iron that made them so successful in their battle tactics? That
Well, I mean, Assyria in general is like this rather large nation, an empire that's really built on the ideas of discipline within their armies. Like their whole culture is built around worshiping a rather warlike god, Asher, and when your religion revolves around never losing a battle because it will symbolize the end of the world, that's a huge motivation to continue to invent and modernize your army because logically you don't really want the world to end.
right, of course, and I think especially there was a lot of pressure on their god. Ishtar pretty much always said to go to war no matter what, right?
Yeah, Asher was a heck of a ruthless god. He's quite a piece of work, actually. He kind of reflects their culture, but I mean, they kind of did it to themselves too because they're realistically they were doing it because their king told them to, and he like the actual emperor of their empire was the one who allowed for these kinds of innovations to come out. Like, for example, actual iron helmets and armor that defended you against the forces of the opposing side, and things like, I guess, their siege engines as well, which probably wouldn't have been as easy to build and work with if they hadn't had this technology of iron.
Yeah, right. And also, just what do you think in their battle tactics that they used iron so much that it actually changed their whole tactics?
Well, I'm not like a specialist in metal, but iron is a harder metal than bronze is, if I'm correct. So, like, if your blades can hold an edge longer and they're sharper and they're more durable, logically, you can be a little more aggressive in the way you fight. It's a real game changer because it changes the way that you can actually fight the battles and the way you can move around your troops and the actual deadliness of the weapons you're using.
Yeah, I'd say a big game changer is actually the weight and the strength. So they could be fully armed infantrymen, and they could move around much faster than their opposition, who would, if they had fully armored, then they wouldn't be as fast since it would all be bronze, or they just wouldn't have armor. So they would have a huge advantage there.
It's unfortunate though because while we have all these like actual examples of Assyrian weaponry, a lot of the tablets and documents around the actual weapons and how they were built have been destroyed because of, well, time and the sieging and razing of cities. It's all kind of faded away back into obscurity.
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of the Assyrians' fault, since once Babylonia took over, there wasn't much love lost between them.
Yeah, they're a real warlike people. They're fundamentally different from a lot of other cultures simply because of their willingness to adapt in order to really appease their god.
Yeah, I think also a big game changer is that Assyria and Ashur, they had the first, or at least the most professional army that you could have. At that time, it was the best army that you could say has ever been on Earth up to that time, and some sources say that over their entire empire, they had a professional army of from 150,000 to 200,000 men.
That's like the kind of scale of army that's hard to imagine outside of a much more modern day army. Like that
Yeah, exactly.
size of army could easily spar with like 13th century European armies because it's so substantial, and having a actual professional army as opposed to a whole bunch of peasants running around unorganized and having that additional level of discipline that brings with it is really, really vital.
Yeah, right, because before, when they had just the militiamen, they were all farmers. They would have pitchfork in one hand and a sword in the other. Then when it was wartime, they would go out on these big war campaigns and fight. Then in the autumn, they would come back to harvest their crops, and their enemies would just come back and take back all the land they got.
Yeah, and this kind of prevented it because you had a real army that you could in fact use all the time specifically for this purpose. They didn't need to like go back home and farm the land because this was their actual job.
Yeah, exactly. And field armies consisted of 500,000 men with 250, that actually was in a space of 250 yards frontage, then also 100 yards of depth. It's in a
That's
relatively small area the actual battle is taking place.
that's pretty scary though. When you think about it, that many people moving together would be quite a thing to actually see.
Yeah, and as I say, they're like, we like to reenact ancient battles, but we really have no idea what actually happened during them. If they just charged into each other and just fell on each other's spears, the enemy's spears, or if there are some historians claim that they race up, then stop in the middle and have somewhat one-on-one hand combats.
Yeah, and there'd be like some kind of a middle zone, but that kind of stuff isn't really described. And I mean, if you can even, wrap your head around what that would look like with something like bronze weapons between two sides, imagine the kind of slaughter that could ensue if you were fighting a professional army against peasants and your professional army was better armed.
Yeah,
The Assyrians
exactly.
were able to like dominate militarily because they were willing to spend the money and take, really pay the price for what they got.
Right, I think, like, to today's standards, or back when, I would think it would be as much as, like in the U.S. Civil War, having the 1853 Enfield rifle musket that was muzzle loaded, versus the Union's 1860s Spencer repeater, which of course you could load through the back slot, and it had 7 rounds. There was just no chance for
The other side,
yeah.
yeah. Especially if your army is so much larger than the other force. Like it's just a combination for slaughter. Anyway, that's our thoughts on Iron